Okay, I'm going to start early. So, you know, what was like, I mean, I always get asked this question because I make all this hard rock records. So everybody's always asking, what was the first record you got? Or what was the first record you remember really having gotten and like that kind of, I assume, meant something to you?
Not counting Oakland Records and Disney and stuff like that. My first album was the second Elvis Presley album. And my first single was Heartbreak.
And so then how do you get from, I mean, I guess there's, you know, like getting from like, say, music, like being interested in music to like working in a store, like that, was that a natural progression or was it just getting a job and then finding you liked it? Or
no,
tell me that, or tell me stories.
Well, I got Christmas '57, I got my Elvis Presley album. Mm-hmm. About 4 months later, I was still in the 8th grade.
Right.
I went and saw Little Richard at Mission High School in San Francisco. And that sort of changed my life. 2 months later, I started working at Village Music because I could get a discount.
Right.
And I worked there on and off until '68 when I took it over. But it wasn't planned, it just kind of happened.
Right, and you had been in your early to mid-20s then when you...
68, yeah, I was 24.
That's a big decision to make. But people were making...
Well, you know, I was in college,
mm-hmm.
my 6th year in college, because I was majoring in gravitation. Coincidentally, Sarah Wilcox, the lady that owned Village Music, called and said she had finally had enough and she wanted to sell the store. At the same time, I had flunked my graph physical practically the same week. I flunked my graph physical, drove back down to San Jose State, dropped out of school that day, and called Sarah and, you know, tell me more. And she had a retired sheet music salesman that wanted to buy the store and needed somebody to run it. So I said, yeah, I could do it. At the time, I was working in a record store down in San Jose. I had just applied at the post office to be a mailman and taken my test and gotten approved and all that, but there was like a 6-month waiting list. So I said, fine, yeah, I can do that. Literally, on his way to sign the papers to buy the store, the sheet music salesman dropped dead of a heart attack. Sarah calls me desperate because she really had decided, I don't want to do this anymore. So I suggested, why don't you let me run the store for a percentage of the profits until I get enough money to buy it? And we did that, and a year later it was mine. But again, it was nothing planned. It just sort of...
How did that change? You know, like your whole, going from being like someone who was like working there to running the ship?
Well, it was, you know, I hadn't really planned on being a record store person my whole life. I really had no idea what I wanted to do. I'd done a lot of stuff in college, you know, janitor, gas station attendant, all that kind of stuff. And so I took over the store, and my goal was to stop one of everything. Because I'm a firm believer that music is all valid, whether you want to sit and listen to it or not. Somebody that collects Andy Williams is as valid to me as somebody that collects the Beatles or Shelley Parker. It's music, and if somebody likes it, then there's some validity there. So I wanted to, the first thing I did when I took over the store, she had like 3 or 4 bins of rock, maybe half a bin of country, maybe half a bin of blues, 40 or 50 bins of classical music and opera, tambourines, guitars, radios, record players, all that extra stuff. I got rid of everything except the harmonicas and the guitar picks, and cleaned out the records and just sort of got rid of what I didn't want to stock and stocked what I did want to stock. And it was a good time to do it because at the time, the record companies were phasing out mono records, so their return policies were extravagant. You could return pretty much anything you wanted. So I I got to clean out a lot of the extra stuff that way and replace it with what I wanted to carry. And it just sort of grew from there.
And do you, like, I mean, at the beginning, do you think you're, because I agree with you with the whole sort of one of everything thing. But how much of your own, I wouldn't say proclivities, tastes play into it?
Of course, a lot of it was my personal taste. There was a time in, like, I think 66, I managed a record department in what was called Gemco in San Jose. It was sort of a poor man's white front, which is sort of a poor man's Costco. And I took over the record department there, and by the time I left, they had the largest selection of blues on the West Coast. They had the largest selection of traditional country on the West Coast, none of which was selling, but it was stuff that I liked, so it was there.
You created a portrait.
I created a portrait, and it went, it went from there. I stocked what I liked, but I didn't turn down. I won't say I didn't like, but I didn't listen to. And it just sort of must turn from there. There's a lot of stuff that I don't necessarily listen to, but I certainly don't turn off. It shows up on the radio or something like that. And I got an early start when I was a kid, because when I started collecting records, again at 13, drugstores and department stores had their version of remainder tables that bookstores have of records. You could get 6-month-old 45s for anywhere from a nickel to 50 cents a piece, and everywhere. And they were around in all kinds of stores. And when I started collecting records, I didn't know that much about it. I'd only been listening to the radio for 3 or 4 months. But I bought by label. Little Richard was on specialty, so anything I found on specialty I would buy. Chuck Berry was on chess, so anything on chess I would buy. And that went with like a bunch of the major R&B labels of the 50s. And that's how I learned. And I also, I started going to concerts right after Little Richard. I'm still at 13. I went to one show that had Fats Domino, Chuck Berry, the Everly Brothers, Clyde McPhatter and the Drifters, Buddy Holly and the Crickets, Eddie Cochran, Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, all in one show. And not long after that, I started taking the bus down to San Jose to go to R&B shows, and at 14 years old, I was seeing James Brown and B.B. King and Bobby Bland and Lloyd Price and Jackie Wilson and Johnny Otis and all of that kind of stuff. So I got a real early start at a lot of different kinds of music. I mean, I basically, in 6 or 8 months, I went from Elvis Presley to Little Richard to Jimmy Reed and Muddy Waters. And then it just sort of went from there. I also had parents that were way too permissive. I mean, letting a 14-year-old take a bus down to San Jose to go to venues that were where I was, to put it mildly, in the minority. Most parents wouldn't do, but I was lucky. I mean, I started early. When I was 10 years old, I used to take the bus over to the city on Saturdays because Market Street had a dozen movie theaters, and if I worked it right, I could see like 5 or 6 movies in one day, going from theater to theater to theater. And I was doing this by myself at 10 years old, which was not something you could do nowadays. And not something my parents probably should have let me do then. But they were...
well, you're still here now.
I survived. Yeah, I survived. But they were excessively permissive, and that helped.
You file that away under the world's a different place now.
Yes, the world is a different place now.
But, you could, in theory, you could still do that. It's just that, particularly the idea of what parents allow and don't allow these days.
Yeah.
And the idea that the idea of liability on some level is much different.
Well, I was walking downtown by myself at 8 or 9 years old, and that's not something that in this world people do anymore.
And I used to go to the Marin City swap meet to go, because that's what he liked to do. And I bought everything there from tools to like weights to
everything,
records to clothes to Playboy magazines, and it was an interesting like twofer for, you know, take a trip from Novato, go there on a Saturday, then come here on the way back. And I don't know, I have records still that I bought in those first years. So it changed my life on some level. But I don't know, I guess some question, you know, like I just, what, like, you know, besides just everything else, what sustained you in doing something for so long in one place?
The music business was fun back then. It was a lot of fun. I was one of the first record stores in the Bay Area to sell used records. Sea of Records in San Francisco had some promos in their basement, and Moe's Books at Berkeley sold some used records. But other than that, used records was not a thing. It didn't happen, at least in the Bay Area. I don't know about the rest of the world. And I got into it because I had so many records at home that I'd accidentally bought twice that I had to get rid of the duplicates. And so I fed them into the store, and hey, these sell. I make more money on these than I do new records. What a good idea. So I started. That's how I got into selling used records. Bill Graham lived up the street, Marty Ballard lived down the street, Dan Hicks lived down the street, and there were just, it was a musicians-oriented town, and a lot of them gravitated to the store, which again helps with the reputation, which again brings more people in, and it just sort of a self-fulfilling thing. But it's not something I did. It's something that just sort of the store did.
And you were like part of that generation.
Oh yeah.
On some level. So, you know, like that Dylan movie that just came out, the whole crux of it is which is kind of, I don't know, whatever. Everybody wants to make a crux out of something for Dylan. But it's like him playing at Newport. And, you know, how that changed what became like, what was like, he was kind of like, they want to say, it's partially true, but, you know, like, I don't know if it's the whole story, but, you know, they want to change his position as being like the folk music's, whatever, guy, to being like pop music's guy, or like a bigger thing, you know, like a larger Venn diagram. And, I mean, would you think, you know, I think you could argue that like you're changing the store from being one that was kind of like a whole different generation's idea of what a music store was, which was something more like, you know, honestly, it's a little bit like a department store.
Yeah.
Or like, you know, like a different version of like what Gemco had, you know, like, in other words, Gemco sold this, sold that, and they had records in bins over here.
There was no difference between Village Music and, say, the record department at the Emporium in San Francisco. I mean, it was
Sears.
Or Sears, they basically stocked the same variety of things, had the same titles of music, the same percentages of genres of music, and that's how record stores work.
But that's how pop culture in some respects was on some level. That, you know, if anything I've learned about music in the 60s, there's a lot of talk about music in the 60s being all this new stuff, but that was just kind of the vanguard.
Yeah.
There were still all those records, you know, like if you look at like I have these, you know, like record sleeves where like from Capitol or from, you know, from all the different companies where on the inside of the jacket, you know, the sleeve, the paper part, it would be like other records we have, you know, Johnny Mathis, you know, this, you know, it's like you bought this record that was like a psychedelic group, but like, you know, the other bands that are being touted are like, just all these other things, which are not terrible, but that just meant that there was a different group of people buying records. You know, like that, you know, like it's not all just, you know, like I really got a big case of that with, there's this episode of Mad Men where Don Draper is like listening to Tomorrow Never Knows, and he just takes it off because it doesn't talk to him. You know, and you're like, well, he looks like he's pretty young. You know, he's what, his 30s or something or whatever at that point, you know, in the 60s. And he wasn't interested. So there was this whole new wave of,
there were
you were like, I would think that like you would be like the store for that group of people. You know what I mean? You know, like the store that was already making, you know, going like, I'm tired, not really, you know, like, I wouldn't even say it was, well, I don't know, it's revolutionary to go, it's just not my thing to do this other thing. I will stock some of these things, and, you know, and I'll respect that, but I want to go somewhere else.
But I was the exception to the rule, though. I mean, when I was in high school, I went to a lot of parties because at Marin Catholic, literally, I was the only person in the school that had a record collection. They just weren't that interested. I was going to concerts, and none of my friends were. I mean, I broke along, like maybe one of my best friends, to one concert and figured, well, okay, you paid your dues, you don't ever have to do it again.
But we can still be friends.
Yeah, we can still be friends. But I was in the minority, even at the height of the CD craze. My business was always at least 75% vinyl. It never dropped below that.
And how did you figure out, I guess with reps, I guess is how, but how did you figure out which new vinyl to buy and sell? You know, like that?
What I thought I could sell, what I read might be interesting, what I heard that I liked. I mean, there was a point in the early 2000s, I could look at a Billboard Top 200 chart, and there weren't more than 20 albums on the chart I had ever sold a copy of. Anybody had ever asked me for. Nothing. I mean, it was just, I was in the record business, but I was as far away from the record business as you could get.
You could go to like drugstores and find 99-cent like clearance records. Was it ever very tempting to buy those new and just bring them back to the store and sell them?
Oh, of course. I did it all the time.
I mean, I have so many stories about people like, you know, they were 10 years older than I am who, like that, there were still times in the 60s and early 70s where like a weird label like Cap would do like a very experimental record.
Yeah.
For almost like throwing spaghetti against the wall or something to see what they, you know, and most of them didn't stick. But then you find that crazy record, like a band like the Silver Apples or something like that, for 99 cents, and that's how these friends of mine discovered
those.
these.
How many Silver Apples albums I bought at 99 cents and sold for $3 or $4 or $5.
Right.
You know, that was a good one in the cutout bins.
That's what I mean.
There were hundreds of them.
Yeah, they were a real loss leader for Cap.
Yeah.
But you know, like